So Max, we're back.
We're back.
I think like most of our best conversations, I'd like us to talk about a tweet.
Okay, so tweets are interesting, and there was one recently that sort of caught our eye as we were preparing for this long episode, which was a tweet about, of all things, Seinfeld. And it's a little chart that explains sort of the spatial topography of the Seinfeld set. And what it's demonstrating is this sort of contradiction in the spatial design of the set. Jerry's hallway actually can't really quite exist because of the way the set is designed.
The way the kitchen sticks out.
Exactly. The kitchen sticks out. It's not physically possible. And so, we're going to talk a lot about space in this episode and the spatial design of, different eras of movie making and media making. And we thought it prudent to sort of laugh at this at the beginning because it's just quite funny to say this thing in the movie is not realistic.
Yeah, this mediated experience isn't just like my experience at my desk before me, like it would be for Rene Descartes. And so it's hilarious. So it was a Reddit thread, and then it was then it was tweeted about under the heading Jerry's hallway can't exist, and it's got like 2.5k likes, right? And the diagram is Cartesian, right? I mean, it's all about that XYZ axis and grid, and it shows you these green lines that run contiguously, right, touching from the hallway, kind of basically passing through part of the space of the kitchen, right? It's showing you how it's impossible Jerry's hallway can't exist. And then what I thought was funny is somebody commented on that thread correcting what was being claimed. No, we see that angle in the show multiple times. The hallway is straight with Kramer and Jerry's doors at the end. The elevator is next to Jerry's apartment. And what I find so funny about this is like, I don't even care, right? Like it maybe it is reconcilable according to Cartesian contiguous space, but we've missed the point here altogether, right? That mediated space, whether it's televisual mediation or, as we on this show like to talk about, monetary mediation, does crazy ghostly shit, right? Like and is like multiple and overlapping and just does not behave according to Cartesian dictates.
I hate it when TV doesn't behave.
Yeah.
So we are here mostly to not rag on bad tweets, but to talk about a television show. I think we're going to call this another episode of Modern Movie Theory.
Yeah.
And we're here to sort of pick up a few threads from our Marx was right episode. You heard it here first, by the way. Marx was right.
And our Infinity War episode.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in our Marx was right episode, we spent a lot of time thinking about what we are calling and, picking up from a series of philosophical debates, a sort of apophatic method, right?
Negative method.
A negative method of illuminating that which is not immediately positively present. And the sort of, as well as that, we're picking up on our engagement in Marvel's MCU, where we had a long episode about Avengers Infinity War, and some of the pop culture, media, political, historical stakes of that particular media form.
Yeah. So what are we talking about today? I'm extremely excited. I've been wanting to talk about this uh like in an official capacity for several months now.
Yeah, Scott will usually just call me and tell me his findings about WandaVision, which have been, let's just say, abundant over the past few months. And so that's what we're here to talk about today, the Disney Plus series that's extending and moving beyond the Avengers series,
It's
WandaVision.
officially phase 4.
Officially phase
Whatever
4.
that means. Phase
Well,
4 of the MCU.
it's the longing phase.
Yeah, it's the trauma
The
phase. Well, I
trauma
guess they're
phase.
all the trauma phase.
Yeah. Well, it's the reflexive trauma phase. More and more so. We'll
Yeah,
get there.
indeed.
Um so
So what is WandaVision? Let's
so
catch people up. Oh,
yeah.
and just by the way, if you don't want spoilers, please just turn this off
Yeah.
and come back another time. Happy to have you again, but we're not gonna hold back.
Nope, we're not going to hold back, and just like MMT spoiled the monetary system, we're going to spoil the MCU for you. Probably in more ways than you could have imagined.
Yes, it'll be ruined by the time we're done with it.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, Scott, because I think you've sort of spent more time rewatching WandaVision than I have. Um, First of all, what is it? And secondly, perhaps why are we turning to it today?
Okay, so I'm gonna need some help because setting up this show, just narratively, is hard to do, and it's hard to do without getting lost in the endless intersecting, intertwining backstories of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But so, okay, it stars two MCU heroes, uh, Wanda Maximoff, who is played by Elizabeth Olsen, and the character Vision, who is actually a synthezoid, is not really a full human, but is more like a walking, feeling computer, played by Paul Bettany. And where the show takes place after the events. I think it's like 3 weeks or something after the events that occur in um, Avengers Infinity War, which we've talked about, and Endgame, right? And that's the moment when the eco-fascist hulking Thanos snaps his fingers, and we call the event the snap or sometimes the blip. And according to his wishes, he has made half of the living creatures in the universe disappear because, according to his zero sum ecology and political economy, he wants to save creatures because the universe is finite. There's a finite amount of resources. We couldn't possibly intergalactically provide for all. So he gets rid of half of us in order to really, really care for the rest of us, right? So part of this story is that for a lot of reasons I don't want to go into, Vision has to sacrifice himself because he's got one of these infinity stones stuck in his skull, and he asks Wanda, who, the two of them are a couple, they love each other. He asks Wanda to do the sacrificial act, right? So like there's so much trauma coming into this show, loss. We think Vision is dead essentially, or
Mm-hmm.
no longer functioning
Mm-hmm.
as a synthezoid, right? So it's really startling when in the beginning of this show, um, first of all, Vision is alive, weird, and it's not explained. Second of all, after the initial Marvel, logo, like animated logo at the top, the aspect ratio, basically the ratio between the vertical and horizontal axes of the screen, shift from a standard widescreen anamorphic, MCU aspect ratio to something much more boxy and something much more like we associate with, well, lots of things, but most presciently for this show, mid-century television, right? The boxy mid-century television, and it happens to be in black and white. And they start acting, and then we realize, oh my goodness, Wanda and Vision are inexplicably in a 1950s white family sitcom, complete with a live studio audience and a laugh track and wardrobe and set design and performance styles and the rhythms of jokes are totally out of the MCU. Like we've left it behind in a way that feel like, when I first saw it, I was really pleasantly shocked by what was unfolding. And then it turns out that a lot of this MCU show, this MCU streaming show, is about Wanda and Vision being, I don't know how you say it, like enjoying or trapped in, being suffocated by sitcoms of the past. And so the overall narrative arc of each show kind of plays out as episodic television with very sitcom-y like problems that are usually about like silly misunderstandings, but like all sitcoms, like are also processing major, you know, political, ideological mores and tensions and contradictions along the way. But then, so then as it unfolds from episode to episode, you're traveling through time. So the first episode is the 1950s. We're in a realm that reminds us of I Love Lucy, the Dick Van Dyke Show, although that's a little bit later than the 50s, that's early 60s, but still that kind of tone. There's also this kind of creeping, for all the lightness of the show and the aesthetics and the tone of the show, there's also this creeping darkness. And I think one of the ways that creeping darkness gets expressed is through a Twilight Zone kind of, you know, things aren't what they seem aesthetic. So then you move through the decades, you get into the 60s. Clearly they're drawing from Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie and the Mary Tyler Moore Show. 70s, Brady Bunch. 90s, it's a little like fast and loose. Like there's Family Ties, which is an 80s show for the most part. There's Growing Pains. There's Full House. Then you get to episode 6, and that's referencing shows like Malcolm in the Middle. Then you get to episode 7, basically the 2010s. We get shows like Modern Family, The Office, Parks and Rec. That's when you start seeing like single camera production and confessionals right to the camera, right? Like more recent television comedy tends to do. And then we basically leave the sitcom world behind. And what's been happening along the way is not just a kind of romp through sitcom land and the history of the American sitcom, but essentially, right, the traumas of the MCU, the traumas of the blip, and the traumas of not only Wanda, but certain other characters who are revealed to be outside of this sitcom space begin to emerge. And we get to have a better sense of where this sitcom is taking place, although I think we would argue that we never really do. And what ends up happening is the show becomes increasingly more and more MCU, right? More and more like everything we're used to. The sitcom aesthetics get stripped away, and the kind of what we've called hyper-Newtonian, physics-obsessed aesthetics driven by digital visual effects kind of take over. Wow, I'm really surprised I was able to do that.
Yeah, I was a pretty great summary, and there's a few things that I want to highlight from it too. First of all, just like you can probably hear it in Scott's voice, just how fun this show is, right? I mean, I think we need to take a second to really like say that, and it's fun precisely because of all of these stakes that are not just implicitly there or need to be really like teased out in with like a needle and thread, but because it's actively playing around in this historical register, right? It's replaying and playing out a history through aesthetics, through a sort of memory of what we might call the sort of origin of the Hollywood blockbuster, in the sense that it's like a pre-origin, right? A what came before the sort of Marvel problematic, that I think we could point you backwards to our modern movie theory episode 1, for more of a spelling out of it. But I do want to hover over a few of these sort of themes that you teased out, and I think the first one is, could I ask you, Scott, to explain what you mean by mid-century aesthetics?
Yeah, that's tricky. So maybe I think what would be helpful is actually for us to review a little bit for newbies and just for, even returning listeners,
Mm-hmm.
just so we're all on the same page, what we mean by MCU aesthetics and what we mean by more broadly blockbuster aesthetics and what we're calling hyper Newtonian aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the way I would start, and it's a little tricky to wrap your head around, but to start, I would say with the Hollywood blockbuster, starting with George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and Industrial Light and Magic in the mid to late 1970s, is they created a new kind of popular aesthetic regime that did everything in its power to avoid forms that seem manifestly abstract. And by abstract, I mean any kind of form that seems like it's bringing together elements that are not immediately contiguously related, and also avoiding simulations of movement that aren't just about, physical objects moving from here to there. And this includes sound design and music as well, right? A sense of the world being, even if it's fantastical, even if it's in the Star Wars expanded universe with all of its creatures and all of its sort of impossible spaces and things like that, it's still all very Cartesian, as we were saying, and really Newtonian, and in a hyperbolic way. So it's really obsessed with extended volumetric space and these really intensive physics, which we would argue suggests a kind of a real anxiety, really about abstraction and about abstract forms, because they're doing everything in their power to make audiovisual experience be a physically immersive one, rather than something that is, more like the Seinfeld tweet, right? Something
Mm-hmm.
that's, and I think we would also say that media, whether it's motion picture media or auditory media or painting or money, always has a dimension of abstraction. It's always mediating, elements at a distance or across distances, and doing so in complicated and overlapping ways. And to deny the fact that media does this is a problem. And then with this, we also say that hyper-Newtonian blockbusters and the MCU, what they do is they give us an impression of the world, a feeling of the world, even if it's a fantastical world, an impression and feeling about the world that really all that matters at the end of the day is physics. The only kind of movement that there can be is one thing moving through space, right, and bumping into another, right? And for us who take MMT really seriously, we know that this is just not how money works, right? Taxes that are not physically taken from one group of people and then shot through pipes through contiguous space, and then, deposited in the government coffers, and then, and they can be empty or full, and then it, through spending, it goes somewhere else. That actually there's an analogy between these hyper-Newtonian aesthetics as really finite and really intensely just materialist, and the way we under neoliberalism imagine monetary relations and monetary mediation. So we are interested in the MCU and blockbusters because they're like, I mean, they give so much meaning to so many people's lives, including our own, right? But that doesn't mean we can't critique them. And so for us, we're interested in, well, it doesn't always happen the same way. It's not, as we would call, univocal, right? It's not always hyper-Newtonian in exactly the same way. I will say it's often pretty similar most of the time, but that's why WandaVision is so interesting, because through its, I would argue, complex nostalgic journey back, and I want to qualify that word nostalgia maybe in a bit, but through that complex journey back, it's opening itself up to previous forms of abstract motion picture media forms, right? That, I would never say this is the revolution, or, yeah, let's just do this and then we can have Medicare for all. Like, that's right. I'm not saying that, but it is exciting and interesting to then figure out, well, why is it doing it? How is it doing it? And how do these forms that are more abstract and open function? Let me just give an example. One of my favorite moments from early on is in a very gendered, stereotypical way that's being kind of winked and critiqued at the same time as it's being explored. Vision goes off to work in his suit, and he puts his hat on, and he's leaving back through the kitchen door, and he turns back to Wanda and blows a kiss, I guess, into his hand, and then he tosses it, kind of pretend, through the air, right? And there's no kiss, right? It's a performative, symbolic act, right? But then there's, I think it's is it chimes? It might be a harp. I think it's a harp sound or something that kind of comes in, and it's what we call non-diegetic. It's like not supposed to belong to the reality of the story world, but then it takes on this like quasi-diegetic feel, right? And it makes us kind of feel a certain abstract reality of this kiss traveling through the air, and then like she catches it, right? And then the score kind of picks up and swells from there. So the show is absolutely unafraid of embracing all kinds of abstract and playful relations, and that's super interesting.
It really is super interesting. And I think one of the things I wanted to sort of drive home about, I loved your description there of and particularly the example of thinking about, right, the way this analogy is functioning, right? Because I think some people maybe think that these sorts of cultural forms or media forms, right, can be talked about alongside political economy, and it's like one shows how the other is functioning, and but I think there's something a little bit too passive about that, and it's important to say that when we're saying that the MCU's blockbuster aesthetics, which WandaVision is undermining in certain ways, are an analogy for the way money is imagined to operate according to a Cartesian or neoliberal spatialized material logics of moving bounded in space from here to there in a finite way and as a finite amount. It's not just that's like, aha, that's what neoliberal money is, right? It's it's that the sort of consciousness of our era, right, of this neoliberal era that we've grown up in and that we're so familiar with, is one that is being given voice to in these forms, but not just given voice to, but actively reinforced in symptomatic ways. And so it's not just that one reflects the other, it's that they're operating with one another as a sort of totality of analogies for a sort of political aesthetic consciousness of what it feels like to not just live within, but participate in at multiple levels of the administrative, legal, political, economic structure of the historical era of neoliberalism. And so these guiding logics are not located in one place and then reflected in another, but the MCU became and was an active way of reckoning with and producing neoliberalism at the level of our sensory field. And so this sort of, that's what is at stake in thinking about the way WandaVision is undermining neoliberal aesthetics, because, and it's important to say, right, the undermining of neoliberalism is something that we see in multiple ways right now in our current historical moment, through the undermining of what people believe money to be, right? And so there's this complicated historical movement and shift that we are looking at, seeing, interpreting, and have been since sort of before, like when COVID was beginning. We sort of discussed, Scott and I, the way that this might affect aesthetics, and we don't want to be determinist on any side of the coin, but a part of this, I think, is looking at the way this sort of kiss flying through the air, but not flying through the air, right? Not flying through space, but being propelled by the off screen, by the out of view, and us being witness to it is a sort of allegory for a world in which there is maybe an alternative to the bounded material view of money and of relationships that must be contingent upon the exchange of one thing bumping into another or touching another thing. And so those historical stakes really come together, and I'm trying not to say words like congeal and metaphorize a contact,
Yeah.
but there's this sort of conjuncture here that we wanna dig into in real detail in order to historicize this moment of potential undermining in a political imagination and an economic imagination that is perhaps newly contestable in ways that we can't quite imagine or understand.
Yeah, and I think the show is both consciously and unconsciously groping around. You know, I think it is. It doesn't even know, right? And we don't know either. But something is being unsettled. I do want to make sure we're being clear here. We're not suggesting that all of neoliberal aesthetics across every medium or art form is hyper-Newtonian, right? And actually, there's plenty of abstract aesthetics out there, right? We're concerned specifically with the blockbuster form, which of course has spilled over into AAA video games and commercials and and TV, right? All kinds of places, and has been for decades. So it's what Frederick Jameson would call a cultural dominant, right? So it matters. It's not just the fact that there is an opening on to a really playful opening up into these abstract forms. It's the fact that this is phase 4. This is launching phase 4 of MCU. And while there has been Marvel shows in the past, it feels like a kind of, it's sort of also announcing Marvel's arrival during the streaming wars, right? So like this is in the heart of the beast, right? This is the heart of Disney, Marvel, corporate behemoth, right? And that's why I find it so interesting, right? It's not just the mere fact that it was made, right? It's that it was made at this particular node, as you would put it, in the cultural production process and at this moment in history.
Exactly. And it's interesting, we've said, thinking about, right, Avengers Endgame, and we said this in the last modern movie theory episode, but thinking about Endgame as an end of sorts, and an ending that is an ambivalent one filled with loss, right? Tony Stark dies, and Captain America goes back to the mid-century moment, which, we're going to probably bracket Captain America for further conversations. But thinking about this renewal or this new moment of streaming, of COVID, it is an important break, right? It's an important break at the level of the industrial apparatus of cultural production, right, and distribution. And so to be like, a historical materialist about it, right, there's an important break here at the level of production. And what we want to suggest is that is not just at the level of production, right? It's also at the level of its aesthetic form, and that, to be the Superstructure podcast, right, it's not one or the other, right? It's both all the time, and these binaries are not sufficient for understanding. And so I think to a large extent we've set up the historical political stakes, and I liked your example of the kiss. It's a really fun one, and there are more we could talk about. There's so many more. I mean, I think it's worth potentially like going through a sort of short list of them that we have here. But so in the earlier episodes, right, Scott mentioned the sort of black and white sort of aesthetics, but they actually, retrofitted old lenses to fit with this sort of contemporary digital video rig. As Scott also mentioned, the aspect ratios are in flux, and they are changing according to the different historical periods and different sort of influences in which these sitcoms are taking place and being drawn from, as well as period specific props. And there's this sort of sense that the world is up for grabs, right? And it's not just up for grabs in a way that a normal MCU movie or series would be up for grabs, in the sense that it's like, what's going to happen? Is everyone going to die, or are we going to be saved?
Who's going to get all the power?
Exactly. Who's going to get all the power? No, the world is more fundamentally up for grabs in WandaVision. There's something really unmooring and destabilizing about sort of not really being able to know what is real, what exists, and what isn't real, and what doesn't exist and
what's possible,
right?
Yeah,
and
being
what's possible.
Surprised by that creativity. So here, another example, a plate. So in a very Bewitched kind of way, Wanda is like cleaning, in also a very gendered way. She's a housewife cleaning plates, dishes, and they're kind of hovering in midair. And and then tries to put one away, and then Vision walks in, and then the plate cracks on his head, and then there's some joking that happens. I'm trying to remember. Do you remember what he said? Like, my husband and his unbreakable head, and that really sets up the kind of double or triple speak of the dialogue, right? So on the one hand, it's a joke that feels like it's straight out of I Love Lucy or what, right? A 50s sitcom. At the same time, we know that Vision's head got destroyed, right? Right. He does not have an unbreakable head, right? And this, I think, also signals like there's a kind of magical indestructibility, even with indestructibility, in these older abstract aesthetics because of abstraction. Whereas the MCU contemporary neoliberal zero-sum hellscape is like, it's as I've called elsewhere, a spectacle of disintegration. Yeah. Anyway, then she's basically like, no worries, we can fix it, right? And so she does her little spell or whatever, and it's like a twinkle twinkle sound on the soundtrack, and then they run in this case the video backwards, right? And the plate reassembles. So it's not the way that something in the Marvel universe will come back together, which we also get in this show, right? So like when Monica Rambeau, the African-American budding superhero in this show, comes back from the blip, we get a very traditional coagulation, a very traditional kind of materialization of her presence, right? This is not how that plate moment works, right? The plate is running the video backwards in a way that's very reminiscent of like super early cinema. One of the the pioneers of cinema were these brothers, the Lumiere brothers in France, in Lyon, in the late 19th century, and they developed this camera, and it was also a projection system. And when they first started showing their very pretty straightforward, very short films like a train arriving at a station or a baby eating breakfast, often what they would do is they would run it forward and then they would crank it backwards, right? And then like the medium does weird abstract things, right? That's very, very different, that is so much a part of the medium, and the medium speaking in surreal ways rather than it functioning as pure Cartesian, Newtonian ways, basically, right? So this is like hearkening back to early cinema. I mean, it's a funny title, but like one of the early cinema films was called A Demolition of a Wall, right? And people just marveled at this demolition of the wall, like, wow, we can watch it over and over again, this kind of contingent moment. But then even more excitingly, they would run Demolition of a Wall backwards, and you see all the debris and stuff like coming back together, but like in an uncanny way, not in the way that, Monica comes back from the blip, right?
Right. And so there's a few of this sort of themes that I want to highlight about this too, because I think, there are other examples too, where Wanda, where there's mistakes made, but it can be fixed. Everything can be fixed, right?
In post,
in post, or on the fly with magic, in post.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And elsewhere at another time.
Exactly. Right.
But all at once.
Exactly. Elsewhere at another time, but still necessarily present in that moment. And there's this sort of general sense, which for an MCU production is quite odd, of a few things. One, second chances, right? That's a really interesting, in a way, the whole show is sort of a second chance, right? And reckoning with what that might mean for Wanda to have a second chance to be with Vision, but also down to the sort of mistakes, right? Like dropping plates or messing up dinner, right? And in this situation where the boss and there was this miscommunication and we don't know who's going to make dinner, a very classic, again, patriarchal sort of sitcom mishap, right? Of a miscommunication that produces this. But in the end, dinner is, dare one say, snap fingers, dinner's created, right?
Yeah. It's a different kind of snap.
It's a different kind of snap. And so there's this general sense of like a cushion, right? It's if we're going to put it in contrast with the MCU, where everything is hyper contingent and the stakes are just hyper dire all the time, right?
And physically hard.
And physically very difficult in that sense. And then physically in the sense of things come together and they shatter into a million pieces.
Yeah.
And putting them back together it's not easy. It demands sacrifice, right? The Avengers have to sacrifice their lives and their families and themselves to have a chance of recomposing this, what has been, turned into ash. And so, but this is all unwound, to keep with your rewinding metaphor, right? In WandaVision, by going back in time aesthetically and in a world of sitcoms to a different sort of cultural mode where the ability to repair, to remediate, and I mean that in all the sort of vibrating ways in which remediation and mediation are acting. This is not something that in this early world is difficult, right? It's playful, it's joyous, and it's a part of the joy of witnessing and watching the show, and it also feels part of the joy of the world of the show, right? And now it's important to say that this world is set up in a particular way to fail in a particular way, and I think we should get into that. But I think it's important to highlight and hover on that sort of moment of joy and playful creation and abstraction when it's in its full realization in the show as a way of recuperating or recovering a sort of abstract mediation that has fallen away, right? And fallen away along the course of history with the rise of the Marvel blockbuster, and the larger Hollywood blockbuster as well. And so perhaps now, Scott, we can move into some of the shape of this sort of loss trajectory and how it's operating.
Yeah. So I want to say just to extend a little bit about what you were saying. This is not, contrary to some critics, this is not anything like a straightforward nostalgia at all. Mm-hmm. So when, and shows are complicated things. They're made by multiple people, and they can have multiple meanings and tensions coursing through them. And they can be all kinds of different levels of conscious and unconscious. And, but I will say that, this show, in fact, is, I think, wary of nostalgia, mm-hmm. right? And that's really woven into the main through line, which is Wanda's trauma, right? So what we start to learn over the course of this show, and it's not the only through line, there are so many through lines, as often is the case in MCU, but what we start to learn is that, we're reminded that Wanda is a traumatic mess, right? We know, and we're reminded that she lost her parents growing up in Eastern Europe, in a fictitious Eastern European country called, is it Sokovia or something Sokovia. Like that? And not only that, but she lost her parents to the Stark, the Tony Stark military industrial American empire complex, right? I mean, a stark bomb is what is responsible for the death of her family or her parents, right? She then kind of comes into the MCU as a villain who's working for the like eternally more Nazi than Nazi organization Hydra, and then is gaining some powers through that, and then eventually becomes an Avenger and gets hooked up with Vision, and then loses Vision, right? And her trauma there is also kind of just one emblematic articulation of a much broader trauma, right?
She also loses her brother in her twin brother in the Avengers films,
right? Pietro, her brother, right? So she just she is a mess, right? It's loss after loss after loss after loss. And what we learn eventually, what's hinted at and then is eventually fully revealed, is that this sitcom world is a giant throbbing symptom, or what Freud would call a compromise formation or a reaction formation. And that basically she has taken over this relatively dilapidated, used to be middle-class town, now clearly suffering from neoliberal neglect. She has taken over not just the town and a house in the town, but the people who lived there, and essentially in a very MCU way submitted them to her will. Although I think that gets ambiguous in ways that outstrip MCU, the usual way that MCU deals with the will. And we start to see it, on the one hand, she's maniacal, right? And violence that, I mean, some fans are still pissed off about, and they're very upset that she gets left off the hook too easily, right? So at the end, so she's violently controlling this world. She's become like a sitcom wife mommy to the nth degree, to a kind of fascistic degree. In a way, you could say, she's very typically, in an MCU way, trying to care for herself and her loved ones and the world. And it whoops, I slipped into fascism. I mean, this is constant in the MCU. And so we start to see the whole sitcom world as this symptom of at once extreme trauma and a reaction formation that's actually destroying herself and destroying the world around her. And I guess one of the things I first said to you when we started watching this was, this is Marvel apologizing for how they ended Endgame, right? Which was this, as I think we pointed out in our conversation, this really sappy kind of straightforward nostalgia, right? Like back to World War II time, the alternative reality where Captain America and his partner get to be together and dance the night away and be white and and cis and hetero and yay, isn't this better, right? And it seemed to me that this show is saying no going back and taking on the forms of whiteness and heteronormativity isn't that easy, right? And it's kind of whack, right? So making something like a nostalgic media journey in WandaVision seems to be, whether it's conscious or not, a way for the MCU and for our popular culture to say, yeah. It's not just that it was better back when, the white man Captain America could have his lover and everything was fine.
Right. I mean, to just, drive this point home, right? We've had David Freund on Money on the Left, right? And whose book, The Color of Property, sort of takes us through how the violence of the creation of the mid-century suburb, which is what Wanda's sort of projection is, is right based on this, not only violence, but it's actively constructing whiteness in America in this era in a very particular way that is excluding black people and then people of color of all kinds, right? And so the not just a straightforward nostalgia, that's really important to say, because I think that's the sort of motor where then we can come back around on the other side and think about the way the nostalgia, in not being straightforward, harbors some sort of potential for thinking mediation in a more inclusive way, and thinking monetary mediation and care in a more inclusive way that can't be reduced to the violences that WandaVision is allegorizing in the care in which it's hearkening back to.
Yeah, and it is so complicated, both kind of at the macro level of the whole show, but also beat to beat and aesthetic choice by aesthetic choice. I will say that we also then have to come back to, what you were just pointing out was possibilities, right? Like redemptive possibilities in this complicated, critical, fraught nostalgia. But then we also have to come back to limits, like what those limits are. And I guess, well, before I forget, I just want to kind of follow up on what you were saying about, essentially like David Freund's work, right? And, FHA loans were created, right? Along with all kinds of financial instruments that created the white redlined American suburb. And one could say that the familial sitcom, right? And there's lots of sitcoms, but they went for family, like couples and then family sitcoms and white ones, right? There's no Jefferson's references here. There's no Soul Train shows, it's white heteronormative sitcoms, families. And what we could say, what this show does, I think, in its own way reveal, is that, that family sitcom was part of redlining, right? It realized redlining, right? And it's crazy to have that thought in mind when you watch the very first moment of WandaVision and the theme song, the opening 1950s sequence for the show, and they're in a car and they're just married, and the lyrics to the song is like they're getting away from the city and moving to the suburbs to buy a house to make a life for themselves, right? What is that? That's white flight, right? That's straight up white flight. And given how, I think self-consciously woke a lot of this production is, that's not just an accident, right? Like that's an acknowledgement that sitcoms were part of redlining and that there's a kind of violence here. And I think, I don't think any of the showmakers would put it in exactly this way, but I do think, in addition to this being just narratively about, Wanda's trauma and the collective trauma of Thanos and the blip and all that, I also think this show is about the trauma of redlining, the trauma of white patriarchal provisioning that made abundance through the magic of FHA loans and sitcoms for a very particular, to construct a very particular kind of racial, gendered, sexual formation. And there's something critical there. I mean, even if it didn't mean to exactly in those terms, I think that's something to affirm about the show.
Completely. And I think also it, if you had any wonder if that was the direction that Marvel was going to go, and I don't necessarily want to talk about Falcon and Winter Soldier, but Falcon and Winter Soldier, I think, drives that home, right? Just how critical and woke this new phase of Marvel is and is going to continue to be. I would guess if I had
Absolutely.
to guess. So
and Falcon and Winter Soldier was actually in the production pipeline for earlier.
Yeah.
Both WandaVision and Falcon and Winter Soldier got derailed by the pandemic because they were midway through shooting, and it just so happened that WandaVision was finished first through post-production, and so they released it first.
And the magic of money mediation and coordinated production amidst a pandemic allowed it to come out, right? And to be streamed into our homes at a time where we can't go to the movies, right? And I think there are all these moving parts. And so the memory of the white flight, the construction of the white redlined suburb as the sitcom, and the sitcom as those things is then, right, it's important to say too then that this construction was constructed to fail, not just as in WandaVision, right? But if we think historically about the sort of mid-century consensus, to use this sort of generic term, the sort of provisioning of whiteness, the inequalities,
the neoclassical Keynesianism,
right? The neoclassical Keynesian consensus, the provisioning of whiteness, the complete abandonment, right? And I wouldn't perhaps say complete, but the active abandonment of citizens and people of all kinds, right? And of all walks of life who were not white. This is built to fail, right? And it's built to fail in the show, but it's also built to fail in the history of America, I think, on our reading. And that's the sort of trajectory of that failure is part and parcel of the way that this history and the aesthetic sort of conjunction of these histories in WandaVision really produce a lot of tensions that are fascinating for thinking about our present moment and dealing with our traumas and dealing with our loss and thinking about how we want to be critical of modes of aesthetic monetary mediation that are austere and that are exclusive while holding some sort of potential, even dare we say, longing for certain forms of abundance amidst that exclusion that can be repurposed today. And it's important to hold those political desires in a productive and generative tension, right? Because there's surplus to be found in that sort of method of, dare we take it back to positing the analogies and sort of thinking negatively or apophatically from their limits to something greater, to something more that we can imagine, and that we can then activate ourselves to produce and provision as a, whether we want to say as a society or as a planet, or however we want to define this sort of universalist vision of ourselves.
Right. Which is not to say we want a Disney corporation, running everything.
Precisely not. Exactly.
Right. So we got to talk about the bad stuff.
Yes.
Like the real limits. And I think we'll go back and forth, but, so here's the problem. And this is when, I knew it was coming, but because it's MCU, but when it came, it broke my little heart, that basically all of this abstraction that has been so playful and critical and just delightful and like campy and queer and just like so fun, all has to be narratively, but also in a more expansive way, aesthetically framed as being like little tricks that occur within a hyper Newtonian universe, right? And like, they really went out of their way to explain this, right? So how how does this work in the show? Well, we're told that, Wanda, with all of her pain and her trauma and her power, has used her energy, right? This like hyper potent, very MCU energy, right, in a symptomatic way to gather and alter cosmic background radiation, which is essentially like the residue energy left over from the Big Bang.
So gold.
So gold, right? Yeah. Exactly. It's vibrating gold, right? She's amassed it, right, around this sad neoliberal small town, and has then been able to, at all of these registers of like, people's minds and their bodies, and the construction of houses and pools at community centers, like production design, like she's able to manipulate this cosmic background radiation so that she can be a showrunner, right? Like Jack Schaefer, the woman who's responsible for creating this show. So it's very meta in that way, but it's all like hyper Newtonian physicalist. And then she starts broadcasting the television signal, sort of all predicated on that background radiation, right? So it's all hyper physicalized, and with that, her feelings and her trauma are hyper physicalized. And then by the time you get to the very last, mega battle, suddenly everything is just devolved, or for MCU fans, they've returned home, right? Which is a finite material universe, where you need energy and power, and someone's sucking it away from you, and you're going to suck it back away from them, and yada yada yada. Now, that is super problematic. It's super neoliberal, and so there is a false story here that, while has critical redemptive potential, as Max has been talking about, at the same time, it's also a kind of physical necessity. Like, it makes the fall into neoliberalism into a kind of, a necessary law, right? Mm-hmm. A law of motion, as a Marxist would put it.
Right, a law of motion, and a part of the forces of the universe, right? And
right, and taking us back to the Infinity Stones, and all that, right?
I wanna interject real quick. Another important way we can think about the way Wanda has constructed this sort of mid-century haven of a space is it's a state of exception, right? So if the entire...
It's a sovereign land.
Exactly. It's a sovereign state of exception. If the entirety of the universe is predicated on a sort of atomized, and I mean that literally, atomized, physicalist, Newtonian sort of immanence, right? And this is an important...
That excludes.
That's necessarily materially exclusive and bounded. Then what Wanda has created is a sovereign state of exception with her power, by which a select few exclusively, and a very select few, in this case, pretty much just WandaVision and her children, which we're going to talk more about. We have to talk about the children. Are able to live this cushy, soft, mid-century, playful, loving life. And so the logic is that's based on the power that Wanda has, right, within her. And of course, this is a quite, like, it allegorizes this sense that the mid-century moment and the provisioning of mid-century whiteness and the abundance associated with that exclusive project is predicated on the U.S.'s victory and the Allied victory in World War II. And just the utter power that the U.S. had in this moment allowed them to mobilize resources in ways that could be abundant for a select few, And this is the logic, but as an exception that was built to fail, because you know what? The laws of capitalism and of the universe and of motion and the way capital circulates, it's always going to grind down that surplus back to zero, back to the null point on the Cartesian map. And so that's what is being allegorized in this space, which I think it's important to also say is called a hex, right? So we're adding this, right? This hex has this magical, this witch-like property. And so I'm going to hand it over to Scott to dive more in.
Okay, so I want to first just say that so there's a kind of underlying fantasy here about that. It's about the built to fail, right? That mid-century whiteness was abundant in its exclusionary way, right? And I think that one way of putting this fantasy, which I think is a widely held one, is, well, the US government, for a variety of reasons, was able to attract enough finite tax dollars, cosmic background tax dollar radiation, but eventually, right, like it's gonna dissipate, and you know what, it was kind of violent and hierarchical and exclusionary in the first place, so that kind of just needed to happen.
It was inflationary.
Yeah, it was inflationary.
Right. We had stagflation, and the show plays out the stagflationary component of this sort of state of white playful exception. Right, an abstract mediation that has to fall apart. It has to fall apart.
It does. And I mean, they play this at so many different levels, and they also talk about it in interviews and things like that too. One of the things I became of the million things I became obsessed with this show is those opening theme songs, which are have been newly written, I mean, from scratch, to kind of mimic the sounds and the melodies and the themes of each era, right? So we talked about the sort of white flight one from the beginning, but there's one that is from the 80s, and it mostly resembles Family Ties. And I started going back and listening to Family Ties and a bunch of 80s theme songs, and it's it's so neoliberal. It's always about I think Family Ties is what would we do, baby, without us? And it's all contracted around that family. Mm-hmm. But there's other ones too. I'm trying to remember some of the ones I brought back from my own childhood. But it really is oh my God, the family's going to be torn apart, right? And actually, the WandaVision 80s theme song is all about forces tearing us apart. And then there's a pun, a double entendre, which is this is MCU. So literally forces are going to tear us apart.
Beams of energy, light, power.
Yeah, right. So it's super self-conscious about how it's doing so. But you brought up the hex, right? So there's so much complicated stuff going on in this show that is, we could say, feminist, taking on feminist kinds of questions and histories and tropes and problematics, both political, social, but also cultural and aesthetic. And also queer, right? And then we also are going to want to talk about race, but maybe we'll hold back on that. So, right, this is a show about witches, and there is a long history of patriarchal persecution of witches in the West, starting in early modernity, right, by an unjust, paranoid patriarchal order, right, that sought to control and exclude women and various kinds of social practices or medicinal practices or midwife practices that didn't fall within the certain patriarchal regime at the moment, right? I mean, the show overtly cites, right, the Salem witch trials. So Wanda here is going from becoming Wanda, who is I guess the only Avenger who didn't like have a nickname like Iron Man or something, right? But so in the comics, which I am not an expert at, but in the comics, right, she becomes Scarlet Witch, and this is in part the story of her coming to see herself and emerge as Scarlet Witch, and she has a special costume by the end, and she's got the name Scarlet Witch, right? So her trauma is routed through this becoming a witch narrative, which gets to the trauma of patriarchal Western modernity, right? It's an even bigger trauma, right? And then at a certain point, the kind of the use of force or the magic or however we want to put it, depending on who's talking, right, gets characterized as a hex, right, like a spell, right? And so it turns out, right, that this town in New Jersey that's also this giant sitcom set and a studio backlot is actually this big cosmic background radiation energy field that you can't penetrate, you can't get out of, and that is called the hex, right? It's like a witch's spell. And I don't know, there was like I think a New York Times article that was critiquing the show for being kind of stereotypically patriarchal, but I think that the show is not that you can't critique it, but I just think the show is way more self-conscious than that. I think it's very aware of the patriarchal dimensions of the persecution of witches in the past, both actual and in media, and it's aware of witches, and especially like diva witches with their alternative powers, as being some kind, even if it's just like a white feminism sometimes, right? But as a long kind of like this ongoing like reservoir of critical imaginary, right, within and against the patriarchal order, right? And so I can't believe we've gone this long without talking about Catherine Hahn's character.
One of my favorites. Who starts as,
yeah. I mean, I don't even have like she is so good. Yeah. There's no words. So she starts out playing the nosy neighbor in the very first episode, and it's so like it's in the 1950s show, everything is so patriarchal. They do these like fake commercials in the middle of these shows. And like the first commercial is for a toaster made by the Stark Company. So a little bit of trauma there, but the commercial has a man mansplaining to you, the viewer, and asking, is he tired of you burning his toast? Right? Like, it's interpolating the housewife, right? And it's all about the man as the king of the castle. And we're supposed to laugh at this, right? In a critical way that's critical of past patriarchy, right? And so the Catherine Hahn character, right, is her name in the show within the show is Agnes, the nosy neighbor, right, who's hyper-sexed. I think that's important too, right? And she's always talking about this turns out to be fictitious husband who's a schlub and never remembers anniversaries, and
she's super horny.
No, she's super horny.
She's super horny.
Not.
Yeah, exactly.
She's super horny, right? So an unwieldy feminine sexuality, right? She's always talking about like how she wishes like Ralph would goose her, and like it's really hysterical. So it turns out that she's the the showrunners will talk about how there was no big bad like a Thanos in this, but she turns out to be the closest thing to that in this show, right? So she's sort of like a bad witch, but it's complicated, and it's complicated in the comics too. Like in the comics, they have a fraught mentor-mentee relationship, and that's sort of like what happens here. So she comes out as Agatha Harkness, the witch, and who's been kind of been manipulating things all along, and like she gets her own theme song and her own little credit sequence thing that went viral, right? It was Agatha all along. And so that's at least two witches, right? And even though Agatha is being MCU and wants all the power, and that's her like sin and all that. She also takes Wanda through this like therapeutic journey. So she becomes a kind of mentee. She becomes sort of like a therapist, like an evil therapist, right? So what you have is with all of this, it's not just like witchcraft and certain feminist tropes, but it also plays out according to the genre logics of what's called maternal melodrama. So melodrama starts out as, I'll try to do this really quickly, starts out as this kind of spectacular, shocking, really morally polarized narrative stage form in the 19th century. There's a good side, an evil side, and they battle it out, and there's usually big effects and explosions and things like this. And then in many ways, the new Hollywood blockbuster is just an extension of that melodramatic tradition, right? What happens in like the 30s, 40s, and especially 50s is that a new form of melodrama emerges, and it's more coded as feminine or women's films. Sometimes it's called weepies, and films like Stella Dallas. Probably the most well-known is the German-American director who left Nazi Germany and started making, he was also a Marxist Brechtian, and then started making these weepies for Universal Studios, Douglas Sirk, right? And he makes films like All That Heaven Allows, and basically these are all about women in often like feminized spaces within patriarchy, and to different degrees and to different critical degrees of self-consciousness, are playing out the injustices and contradictions and tensions and failures of mid-century American patriarchy, right? And so, a lot of important feminist film theorists and historians have written all about this. You can go explore. Linda Williams is an important scholar on this. There's many more. Marianne Doan is another. So it's important to realize that this kind of genre or mode of the maternal melodrama is always about loss.
Yeah.
It's always about women, usually women in relationship with women, and usually around questions of loss. It's often mother-daughter, but it could also be, in a certain sense, Agnes and Wanda are not like literal, kin mother and daughter, but they end up kind of coming into structurally a kind of potentially a relationship like that, right? So it's all, this genre is like one way in popular culture, which, as we say time and time again, is not univocable, right? Is variegated, even if it's problematic often, is acknowledging the traumas of patriarchy, right? And it's inviting the spectator to explore emotionally, aesthetically, and intellectually those problems of loss. And sometimes it's like the sacrifice, a mother sacrificing her relationship with her daughter so her daughter can go off and have a better life in this very zero-sum classist way. It plays out in different ways, but it's always kind of, I think at bottom, kind of empathetic, right? So that's what's happening here too. It's a maternal melodrama. And in fact, it's a kind of save a little bit of the gravitational fall story that we get, that, it's the cosmic background tax dollars that are, flying apart, and it's got to happen. I think the fact that it plays out as a maternal melodrama that's actually compounded at multiple levels is interesting and really matters, right? It's acknowledging that loss. And then I think, there's a lot to say about race, but one thing to say included in the melodrama framing is that Monica Rambeau, the African-American character who had shown up in the not played by what's her name, Teyonah Parris, right? But as a kid in the recent Captain Marvel movie, she's all grown up and she has her own story here where she's becoming a superhero and getting superhero powers, and then she's going to go off and be in the next Captain Marvel movie, and if you read the comics, you know, she herself becomes Captain Marvel. So like there's a kind of racial politics trajectory to her story that not everybody was fully satisfied with. You know, they want good representation of Black women now, and that's fine. But so that's happening, but that's all routed through maternal melodrama as well. She loses her mother is sick. I think she has cancer or something like that before the blip, right? And then I think she might have even gone into surgery, her mother. And then she goes away from the blip, comes back 5 years later, and then her mother lost her in the blip, and then she comes back and she's lost her mother. So it's this like, you know, double time travel loss, right? And then her loss becomes the source of her empathy to help Wanda, both from the inside and outside. So she becomes part of the sitcom universe, right? And she's fabulous. I mean, her performance is incredible too. I mean, it's not all Catherine Hahn. She's so good. And so she's entangled in this maternal melodrama kind of network with Wanda and with Agatha Harkness too, who herself we see, right, like had all these problems with her mother and her coven, you know, back in the Salem witch trials, and right. So yeah, that all makes this like super interesting from a kind of a critique of patriarchy point of view.
And one thing I think also to note, right, if when we're talking about mothers and mother-daughter loss and all of these relationships of familial care and love, right, it's important to have the backdrop, like all of these traumas are playing out, right, are of course being allegorized through this familial relationship, but we can read them not necessarily on their own terms and think about the way love and care can then function, right, if we want to do the sort of economic language from at a more macro perspective, right, and that can end up derailing some of these feminizations of those relationships, right, thinking about the way, you know, that governance and provisioning, it does provide a sort of cushion of care, right, and that we can even push harder and, you know, push to arguments like Sophie Lewis and others who argue for like a sort of fully social surrogacy as a matter of political economic radicalism, right? There are ways in which these relations don't have to be read on the terms of their immediate contiguous familial structure in order to then open some of these losses and problems to a more generalizable problem of trauma and carelessness, right? And so it's important to keep zooming back in and out in that way when we're thinking like theoretically how we're interpreting this film. And I also think it's important that you mentioned Douglas Sirk, because All That Heaven Allows, which is the classic, right, this sort of classic maternal melodrama, I think, you know, I was taught maternal melodrama with this film, is, you know, there's also some formal experimentation at the level of color and other things and in the film, and number one, and number two, the medium of television is itself played with in that film. And as a sort of relationship of mid-century sort of, you know, the patriarchal imagination of femininity. You sit in front of the TV, you're at home, or the man goes off to work, right? So there's all of these sort of deep tensions in the Marvel's move to streaming and right, and all of these really interesting relations that are sort of at stake in this sort of potent memory of a fraught potentials and really stark fraught limits that then come to a head in our moment right now via and as the sort of Marvel Cinematic Universe's future, and what we can, how we can think about cultural production going forward and provisioning today for us now in COVID and beyond. And so all of these sort of feminist and queer, and then of course importantly racial tensions that get played out and critiqued in this film, or in this series, and you see I'm already playing the film series, like already stuck in the past here, is it's really conjuring a problem, right? And it's conjuring an important problem that it can't quite have an answer to, right? At the level of its logic. It can't solve it. But it is new in the way at which it's conjuring this problem reflexively, rather than just burying it under the weight of gravity, as it did in many of as Marvel has done in many a past versions.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you, just to kind of spell it out, is, I do think that not only can we read this beyond familial kinship, I actually think that there's something very self-conscious about that. I mean, there's networks of solidarity in this show that, even though it is centered around a whiteness that must break open, right, that must fall apart, we can think about the network of difference, right, that even when it's fraught, right, that appears, right? So like we could talk about, Randall Park as Jimmy Woo comes back, right? And there's a number of characters that we can see as being in solidarity with one another for a variety of reasons, often shared pain, right? Or differentially shared pain. And, like the big mortal bad is the just the straight white douchebag who runs Sword, right? Who's just a warmonger and just wants to control with bombs and surveillance, right? So yeah, I think very self-consciously it wants this kind of solidarity. Whether it's good enough is another question, but I think it is groping toward it. And then, the tragedy is that solidarity can only ever be as good as gravity allows. I mean, that's where they end.
All that gravity allows.
All that gravity allows. And that's so tragic, right? That's horrible, right? Because essentially we can't afford it.
Yep.
Right? We can't afford our solidarity, right? But, we who, are in solidarity with Sarah Nelson know that solidarity is stronger than gravity.
That's right. And so, yeah, there's so many different angles I think we could go at this. I think it might be useful to think about Monica Rambeau's character too in another way. There's her empathy and her shared differential but shared pain, analogous pain to that of Wanda, drives a sort of her a sort of identification with the problem of what Wanda's experiencing, right? Wanda is sort of not in the loop. I mean, that's a sort of important. It's an important way to think about this, right? Wanda doesn't really know what's happening while it's happening.
It's opaque to herself. Right. Yeah. And I think this is very important too, that the show begins with a mystery that's opaque to the characters and super opaque to the audience, right? Like, it's fun, but there's trauma, but we don't know why and what the hell is going on. And it's like, where did we come from? And like, where did we come from as sitcom watchers? Where did we come from as racialized or gendered beings? Yeah,
but what Monica Rambeau's character, importantly offers here, right? In light of sort of Wanda's being in the dark, right? Like, what's happening to me? Where am I? What is this world that did I do this? Like, there are all of these questions that are shared with the audience, right? Monica has a real clarity, right? And has a sort of identification of, you can sort of tell Monica can see a path and knows what needs to happen, right? Monica needs to get to Wanda, right? And there needs to be a real clarity established with regards to what is happening, what the relations of trauma are, and how we can move forward from them. And
it has to be speech, right?
Yeah.
It has to be a talking cure. It can't be about Powerballs.
Exactly, right. It has to be a talking, like, men fight with Powerballs, right? But, but there's weird sort of, there's this weird unusual, right? I think that's a really great point. It's an unusual sort of need, right? It's not a let's coordinate to then fight. It's to stop this from happening and move forward. There needs to be a reckoning, of a verbal reckoning, right? A conversation, an encounter that can provide clarity as to what injustices need to cease, right? Like that this suburb needs to be left behind in various ways. This world, this construction needs to be left behind. And of course there are many different ways in which this is limited, but I do think having this sort of causation at the level of knowledge coming from the Monica Rambeau's character it's a really interesting way to think about a sort of the way a sort of white feminism needs to fall away into an intersectional feminism, right? And this is a very crucially important sort of intervention, right? And literally, like, Monica has to intervene and like force her way into this hex, and it changes her to establish and really end the cycle of trauma. Now, that's a reading that I would call charitable, right? But that one that I'm sort of being creative in trying to refract.
And I think we can
refract something
right.
more.
I think we can honor the complaints that she ends up being more of a sidekick. Yeah. And I mean, I understand where they come from, but I will say that I would push back on the idea that she's merely a sidekick or she doesn't really matter and she's just, simply serving Wanda. I think it's a lot more complicated than that, but I get where that's coming from.
And I just want to say it's not, the reason why I disagree with that is because it's not just about Wanda, right? It's also about all the people that Wanda has sort of imprisoned with her hex, right? And it's about saving them from this unconscious construction, right? And so there's something important in that too, with regards to solidarity and for others who are suffering.
Absolutely. And I think we can push all the way through the looking glass. And I think this would be what we in humanities call reading against the grain move. But you could read certain impulses in the show, in the construction of the cosmic background radiation and this in the sitcom as a symptom, as a defense formation, right? As a violent one, as an exclusionary one. You could read this as MCU in some way admitting that that's what hyper-Newtonian MCU aesthetics themselves are, which is essentially what my argument about those aesthetics are, right? Like they are reactionary defense formations that are trying to articulate a world that is going to feel comforting in some way, but that do so on totally violent zero-sum terms, right? So to have somebody kind of overtly sick with hyper-Newtonian symptoms, right, suggests that there's something being admitted here. Now, I think ultimately the fact that we don't really end in the magic of mediation, but in the disintegrated, atomized, I mean, you could say it goes two ways. Like on the one hand, you end up with Wanda in the woods because it's MCU and some alienated Avenger has to end up in the woods by themselves. And then there's Monica, who goes into a movie theater and is like, wink, wink, everybody should go back to the movies after COVID, and like look up at the screen and look up at the universe, and there's all this potential. But I still think it ends us with hyper-Newtonianism as being the baseline, but there's still, I think, a reading that allows us to really see how the trauma, hyper-Newtonian form is itself a symptom.
Absolutely. And I think before we get into the sort of, I think, guiding thematic takeaways that really open up, like that continue that reading, I wanted to just take a second to talk about the children in this Hex universe, right? Wanda envisions children, and the sort of bizarre narrative arc of their creation, their growth, and their ultimate demise in a sort of bizarre way, right? And so throughout the sort of the years of the sitcom as it moves through the decades, right, there are all these weird time distortions that happen, including like Wanda gets pregnant, and then
in a single episode, she goes from being like 4 months pregnant to 9 months pregnant
to giving birth and giving birth to twins, right? So there's this recreation of her life and past traumas, and Monica plays an important sort of crucial role at the node of the giving birth, right? Actually facilitates like and walks and helps Wanda give birth to the children, to be cast out afterwards, and then she has to come back. But
and she gives birth instead of the super sexist mid-century doctor, right, who's condescending and is just awful.
Yes, exactly. And so there's something in that encounter that's really important too. But throughout the show, my sense of what the children were was it was sort of, the children were almost props to me, right? It felt that way, right? In the sense that they of course played important roles in the sitcom, and like, you know, the important sort of plot cruxes and all of these, you know, things that children do, but they were there for the sake of the form, and there wasn't sort of some motivating factor with regards to the whole narrative, and so they grow in weird ways, you know, throughout and they do it by themselves throughout the time, and you know, sometimes they're small, and then all of a sudden they're, you know, 12, and there are all of these,
right, which is playing with, you know, I mean, episodic television that has children, and you know, I myself was on some of these kinds of shows.
You're one of the children.
I was one of the children. You know, I mean, I never had a regular, I wasn't a star of a show, but like the, you know, kids who are on shows, like you shoot for a few months and you go away and you come back the next year and suddenly your voice is dropped and you've got stubble, and you know, like, so then it's a question, do we replace you with somebody cuter? Do we, you know, do we just explain away how much you've grown up now? Right.
So Timmy's gotten really big, you know?
Yeah. Right. And so they like very playfully point out, you know, that's also part of sitcom mediation, and how, you know, these shows go on for years, and when we're representing a family, you know, kids grow up, but you're not shooting the whole time.
Right. It's movie magic, right? And so, you know, television magic, and so that gets thematized, and really they become a sort of, again, like a sort of abstract sort of medium and prop throughout the whole show, and they help process the loss and mediate the loss, and ultimately at the end, when Wanda realizes
they become the loss.
When Wanda realizes she has to give up the hex and this projection of, you know, for the real world, the children have to go away too, and they just sort of go away or cease to exist. What some might say, die out of frame. And
they're born out of frame and they
that's
die out of
right.
frame.
Well, this is where I'm leading, right? And so that's an important part because, you know, on top of the like giving up on the 2.5 children patriarchal vision of like what valid existence is meant to be for families and for women as well, this movement sort of, I think, unveils some of the two themes that I think we wrote down in our notes that really like there's something guiding about the show with regards to these themes, and the two are right and refracted through the children, which Scott just mentioned, the out of frame and creation. And so, you know, we began this conversation with a sort of joke reading of a tweet about Seinfeld and how you know, the spatial topography doesn't work because the kitchen and the hallway and but you never see one another. So I guess that's how they did it. But this sort of confusion that, you know, I imagine Descartes looking at the world just being confused as to how this works. But the answer, right, is it's the production of this media world is coming from out of frame. And that's the apophatic, right? That's what's conjuring and what can be conjured and reconjured through mediation and remediation. And
that's money.
And that's right. And that's money. And that's the provisioning capacity of money as mediation, which, of course, as we know, as we've talked about before, right, the windfall of the Marvel and Disney, there's so much money that's just being, you know, I don't want to say I'm not going to say pumped or piped or poured, but that's being extended to these projects, whether in the form of bank loans or in the form of all different types of public infrastructure and active
tax breaks.
Yeah, right. Tax breaks and active production. I mean, a great example is I just finished Falcon and Winter Soldier, and at the end, it's just like, you know, the Georgia Peach. Here's a bunch of tax breaks.
Yeah.
Right? This was filmed in Georgia.
This was shot in Georgia too.
So it makes perfect sense, right? And so there's all this support that's going into these shows that are not in frame, right? They're not immediately in the frame. And that this is a way of thinking about money and public provisioning of all activities, right? Of, you know, of this recording this podcast and everything that goes into that. And, you know, we could go on and on up through the nested structure of micro to meso to macro. And this out of frame is exactly what the sitcom is always and was always allegorizing, right? Whether it's the mid-century patriarchy and its tensions, or later on, the sort of, as you said, with Family Ties, the forces of discontent and disruption that neoliberalism brought with it, right? And we could go on and on and on. And so there are a lot of ways to think about this creative capacity of the out of frame. And I think I want to hand it over to you to see if we can think specifically about some of them.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is one of the ways of articulating our critique of the blockbuster hyper-Newtonian aesthetics in the MCU as it typically plays out is that the out of frame is, you could say abstraction is repressed, and with it, the out of frame is repressed, and repressed as a kind of open question and an open construction. So, you know, filmmakers have known this from the early days of beginning to, well, you know, frame, you know, frame the world, right? I mean, you could say this is in photography, this is a problem of painting, right? But in cinematography, framing, but then also editing. Mm-hmm. Right? So when after about a decade of cinema, we start seeing, you know, a construction of space and time that is not only just pointing a camera at things or people or rivers or whatever, and then displaying it or telling a story, but is conjuring a sense of what lies beyond the frame. And it can do so in all kinds of ways. You can do so through sound. You can do so through implication. You could do so through, you know, what's called an eye line match, right? A character looks off frame, kind of above the camera or to the right, and then you could cut again and then see a shot that is what they were looking at, right? So what hyper-Newtonian aesthetics tend to do to the out of frame is essentially like a temporal version of what Renaissance painting did to the out of frame. Think about, Renaissance painting is a contiguous space that's organized by material forces and above all gravity. And there is an infinite vanishing point or more that recedes on the horizon, which tells you what? It tells you that the logic of the space that you are visiting, you are seeing, you are inhabiting in this painting will continue on in the same way forever. It is univocal, right? It will not change, right? No one's going to snap a finger and suddenly plates are putting themselves back together again by going reverse.
Suddenly
right?
There's a hallway where there should have been a kitchen.
Yeah, right. None of that's happening, right? It's univocal forces and gravity and, what eventually we start calling Cartesian space, right? And what hyper-Newtonian MCU aesthetics do is they say everything off frame is going to be hyper-Newtonian physics, no matter what. It's always there. And in fact, they remind you all the time. One of the tropes of the MCU, and especially the Avengers films where they assemble, is you'll be on a relatively tight shot of a character or maybe a couple characters, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, another character, might be a good guy, might be a bad guy, might be somebody trying to come to save somebody, it might be somebody coming to punch somebody, it might be played for terror and horror, it might be played for laughs. But all of a sudden, some figure, some character will just rush in from the side, from the out of frame, with so much more force than you could have ever been prepared for as a spectator, which is always reminding you to be on your toes as a spectator, that there are wild univocal forces all around this universe that could attack and invade the frame at any time, right? So the out of frame
like a Hobbesian state of nature.
It is, absolutely. And so even though the out of frame is a constant construction, they are constantly constructing it to make it seem like, no, it's homogenous everywhere. Yeah. Like, it's different in the sense that there's more or less, forces or people making decisions or creatures, destroying buildings, but it's essentially all going to be some version of that, right? But what WandaVision does, as we've been suggesting, is it really leans into that weird Seinfeld, like impossible media space, which is not, I would not say is a break from reality. What I would say is that actually our forms of media, our forms of language, our money, our social cultural relationships are always constructed in these complicated ways that are overlapping and nested and do not behave and are maybe even paradoxical and do not behave according to, any kind of straightforward contiguous physics, right? So I would say that there's something in a weird way, like more real about leaning into that kind of surreal form of mediation. And I also think it's interesting, as you pointed out, that creation in the form of making a baby, right, and death, right, are both deliberately, according to tropes, right, but are deliberately figured as part of the out of frame. And it's suggesting to us that the out of frame can be this mysterious site of potential that we're dependent on, that's heterogeneous to what we know in the here and now, rather than a univocal hostile projection of Hobbesian forces that go for infinity,
right,
in and through an infinity war.
and so it's this peeling back towards a meta layer, right, that the show is doing, right? First of all, the show is a show within a show, right? And that's actively thematized. And there are viewers in the show who are watching the show just as entranced in the show of WandaVision, the sitcom, as we are at home watching WandaVision the Marvel streaming show, right?
Right, and precisely not as material immersion, but as a media immersion,
exactly,
not a material
right?
immersion.
They're adjusting the antennas on their old TVs, right? And so there's this peeling back of the layer to the meta that, because, and I think this is in part because the show is preoccupied with trauma and loss, right? And there's this psychological register that is, there's a sort of de-escalation of the sort of repression and the tension of the that's associated with the out of frame, right? So, as you suggested, in typical MCU, there's a full repression of the out of frame into a bounded Cartesian spatialized world. But in WandaVision, there's you peel back and you dilate the frame, right? So the out of frame becomes a part of the frame. And so this sort of unveiling of some of the creative capacities and production contexts of the multiple layers of WandaVision as a show within the show is a way of sort of revealing and opening up the question of the heterogeneous forms of mediation and creation to a critical context with which the show is entirely, I would suggest, the moral thrust of it is dedicated to that critical context, whether it's patriarchy, whether it's racism, and then also importantly, a sort of a humming through line is also a sort of incipient queerness associated with, whether it's the Agnes character or the sort of, as you said, the campy aesthetics there in the witch thematics. There's a sort of incipient and queerness that, you know, as you've told me and sort of told me about, like the Bewitched sitcom has this sort of historical association with queerness, and there are themes being drawn from that sitcom as well, and so all of this critical layer, in addition to the meta framing, allows for it on our reading, right? And I think it's important to put this in clear terms, a politicization of the production of form of mediation in both aesthetic, cultural, and monetary contexts, because it's all of those things, and it's of course, and all of those things go into producing not just our reality, but also these very particular realities which we are participating in a conversation about and participating in viewing and are a part of the sort of aesthetic fabric of our culture, right? And so drawing to this meta layer and allows us to really question and question the logics of the production aesthetics that the MCU itself insists on, even in this, at the end, even in this series. And so there's a scene that I think I'd love to hear you talk about more, that's sort of like the big reveal on this out of frame, meta frame sort of question in the penultimate episode. Feel free to diverge from my suggestion first, but I'd love to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to talk about Bewitched.
Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe we're going pretty long. Maybe let's talk about the Previously On, which is the name of the penultimate episode. So it's pretty hard to just talk about, I know the moment you have in mind, it's pretty hard to talk about it in isolation, because in so many ways it's been built up to, like, there's been a thematization about the out of frame throughout the show, and it's not just about, you know, harps, you know, doing kind of sitcom, but originally like vaudeville off-screen sound effects that are not so-called realist, but are, you know, animating the world in ways that are abstract, right? But it's thematized even in the dialogue and the narrative. I mean, the second episode they're lying in bed in their, they're each in their own little single bed or double bed or whatever they're called, right? They're sleeping separately. And there's like knocks at the window, right? And then they get scared, and there's jokes about it. And then it turns out, at the end of the day, it was just, like a tree branch bumping up against the window, right? And then later on, I think in that episode, this strange person who seems like a beekeeper pops up from underneath, like from a manhole, right on the street. And then Wanda basically edits that out. Yep. And then they go back to a nice, happy sitcom ending where they kiss on the sofa or whatever. And I think that's actually when they go to color, mm-hmm. right? With a little bit of like queer nod to Wizard of Oz there. And so like the off scene is like a site of play, of queer play, of terror, of unknownness, but not necessarily reducible to hyper-Newtonian, right? And then the audience is part of that too, right? And it's like they shot with a live audience in Georgia for the first 2 episodes, but they also have a laugh track that they created in historically specific ways, consulting some laugh track expert for, how did people laugh in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. So that's part of the construction out of frame too, right? And so then the question of the audience, and where is the audience? Well, the audience is, this show was shot before a live studio audience, and we're used to that saying and that trope, and we sort of imagine that there's one there, but also it's us at home, and that kind of abstract relationship and how that's mediated, maybe in a crappy way, but by the laugh track, right? But here is experienced as a kind of mediating layer, right? In an ironic, interesting, fun way. So the audience becomes a major figure for the out of frame. It's not the only part of the out of frame, but the audience is like, it's important, right? And then in that previously on episode, it's crazy to me because, like, on the one hand, I think once I realized that this was going to collapse inevitably according to the laws of capital and the universe into MCU hyper-Newtonian territory, I think I didn't fully appreciate, like, I gave the inevitability too much inevitability. And I think it becomes inevitable in the last episode. But I think that penultimate episode is so, like, interesting, and it's not abstract in the same way that the earlier sitcom abstractions were working, but it becomes abstract in a way that's more like a kind of experimental independent cinema, or, as historically speaking, kind of comes out of the tradition of what's called art cinema, where precisely, space and time does not ever perfectly add up, and it's paradoxical, and that has real meaning, and the ambiguity of space and time is as meaningful as resolving some of those paradoxes or those contradictions or tensions, right? And this happens again and again. So, like, in that penultimate episode, it's sort of like it's that therapy session that we were talking about, where Agnes is taking Wanda back through her life and all her traumas, and it's a little bit like It's a Wonderful Life, right? or these other films where, like, you get Scrooge or whatever, like you get a guide that takes the character who's fallen back through their life to explore and learn and grow, right? So there's some of that, except here it's not an angelic figure. It's somebody who wants to exploit her for her power, right? So she's like giving her forced therapy for that. But the way that therapy works is it's a little strange. It's not MCU, right? Like, the different scenes of her life are like they travel to them by opening up doors in a space in a contiguous way. So this is like, this is what a surrealist film would do, right? It's like you open a door from one space to the other, and they're not actually contiguous. Like, it's figured as contiguous, but the spaces themselves are so far apart, and in time too, right? So they open a door and suddenly they're in Sokovia, and stepping into the family scene of happiness and watching the sitcoms on DVD with the family, and then you have to experience the trauma, right? So weirdly, contiguity ends up creating an abstract experience. So that's really defamiliarizing in interesting ways. And then it ends up, maybe you can help me describe the moment that you were teeing up, but like, it ends up back on the original 1950s sitcom set, right? Where we start, right? And Vision and Wanda are there in black and white, and then we reveal, as often happens in this sequence, that Wanda and Agatha are behind them, or in that scene too, watching, right, as like ghosts or whatever they are. Then Wanda and Vision disappear, and then we get this kind of shot that we've been describing as Fellini-esque, right? Like very much in the mode of Federico Fellini, this Italian art cinema filmmaker, well known for films like La Dolce Vita and 8½. He loved these like dizzying panning shots, not like, like Transformer movies panning shots, but like slow, but kind of dizzying, and like there's no sense of establishing the space and time in a very clear way, right? We get this shot of like all of these production lights, but we don't even know where they are. We don't know where they are in relationship to, we've never seen them before, right? Then we get a shot of Wanda kind of moving her eyes in the same pattern as the pattern that we've been looking in. So then it becomes what's called an eye-line match, which I've mentioned before. So it's kind of like Wanda's looking up at these lights. Then we cut back again, or the camera starts moving again in a Fellini-esque way, and it ends up kind of turning around and slowly revealing that you're on a soundstage, and you see the audience, the bleachers, but there's no audience except Agatha, who's sitting, being sadistic,
clapping
and saying sadistic and clapping, as an audience member. And she herself had been revealed in the episode before that, when they were doing all the confessionals in the like the Office style, right? She was revealed as being behind the camera that whole time, behind in those confessionals. So Agatha's associated with the out of frame now, with the unknown and the mysterious, the audience too, and now suddenly we're given the contiguous space that we've never seen before of the audience, right? But they're missing, and that seems like it needs reading. And maybe I'll let you do that. And then what is even crazier is, so I think there's another snap, right? I think Agatha snaps, disappears. Basically, she's got her kids, like choking them outside. And then Wanda runs out of the studio door, right? Like not on the soundstage, not on the set of the family house. And where does she leave? Where do we see her on the other side in what's called a graphic match cut, or a match on action? She's coming out of Agatha's house. So we were just in so-called Wanda's house, but she comes out impossibly, like that Seinfeld thing, but on, like on speed. This impossible space, like it was her house, but it's a set, but now we're in it turns out we were in Agatha's house. And then Agatha's house is revealed to be the actual house that was used on Bewitched on the back lot. So like, so much,
so many layers. I want to focus on the audience part, because I think this is the crux of like, really, like we've gone through all of these sort of readings of the way WandaVision conjures a problem and conjures questions about the out of frame and creation and provisioning and intersectional sort of movements and feminism, like today, and the way wokeness is interacting with our time and cultural form and aesthetics. But I think if you had to locate the one moment where the film, that I would want to emphasize as the moment that I think the film has the most to teach us with regards to its its tepid attempt to answer its conjured problem, which we've teased out, is in this moment of sort of the empty seats of the studio audience. And the audience is gone, right? Like the sitcom audience, they're gone. Like we can recreate it, we can do all of these things, but that moment has passed, right?
And they've disappeared on the laugh
right.
track. Like once you get into, I don't know when it is, but I think that single camera mode, like the Modern Family mode and all that, the laugh track is gone.
So it's gone from the show, and we're in a different aesthetic moment. We could say it as far as reliving or re-experiencing that history. That was a loss that it was necessitated by the change in the aesthetics as it moved through the influences variously of the sitcoms. But there is also a sense for me of looking to those seats and, Agatha clapping, right? Which is at once is like, look, it's me. I'm your audience. I was here the whole time, right? None of it was ever real. There's that sort of more simplified reading. But I think what's really interesting about that reveal of the out of frame, and this is a sort of now meta frame of a soundstage in the show, is that the empty seats, there's something the show, I think, wants about, like, it wants those seats to be filled. They're still there. The audience is still there. And we can think about COVID and empty seats in movie theaters. We could think about all different ways in which the community of the participation in the production of a sitcom, all of these, and the identification, the abstract relationship of the viewer at home laughing along with the laugh track, there's a sort of almost deferred longing for the past, but as a sort of present of a way of filling those seats, of reckoning with audience and a sort of collective totality of the experience of watching.
And it matters that it happens at a moment of paradoxical space.
Exactly.
Right? It's at the moment when mediation cannot be reduced to the material here and now, univocally projected onto a Hobbesian
exactly
galaxy.
It matters specifically that spatial formation, because as we demonstrated it, as I tried to tease out in our Marx was right episode about the negative or apophatic method, right? The seats themselves in the empty spaces of the lack, it conjures something, right? It conjures something there. And in this case, it's both a historical memory of laugh tracks and studio audiences, but also I think it also conjures today, watching it now through this sort of looking glass recreation, memory, nostalgia, loss, trauma, present, future paradox that WandaVision represents, the potential for thinking about the way people can have a role in the production of not just in the very narrow sense of as a studio audience in cultural productions, but in the out of frame. And the need for people in the out of frame and those seats to be filled with a diverse array of perspectives and different inclusive audiences and identities. And this is how we might think about the sort of wokeness of the MCU today, alongside its allegorization of mediation aesthetics as a sort of monetary politics of really, we use things like seat at the table as a metaphor, or, but there's a way of it almost like a fallen or not yet democratization, right, of some sort of process of representation that can allow for an inclusive register of this sort of mediation and play, right? So an inclusive provisioning, an inclusive abundance, rather than a white patriarchal mid-century abundance that is predicated on the violence right? That's whose abstract cushions and remediations are predicated on the violence of the mid-century exclusion of people of color and of women as well. And so that's for me, that's the crux of like this moment of destabilization, defamiliarization. What's happening? Where have they gone? What do we do now? Right? And that there's a lot of multi-directional, not contiguously spatialized historical temporal questions that are at stake in that moment, that I think, it's weird to say it gives me hope, but I think when a cultural form, a mass media popular form, is able to ask those questions, it forces me, at least as a sort of analytical actor, to ask them as well, and to ask perhaps how, why something like this is open now in a way that it wasn't before, and that I think is where I would like to leave thinking about WandaVision for now.
Yeah, I totally agree. I do want to reiterate, for all the praise we heap on this, in addition to the critiques, it really is, it's about the fact that this is a this is a massive production at the heart of corporate production, right? So yeah, no one mistake us for saying this is the revolution.
No.
Or no. It's precise. There's plenty of more interesting, woke, participatory, fabulously abstract art and culture out there. Right, we're interested in taking the pulse of the big corporate apparatus that we want to critique. We'd like to dismantle. We'd like to crowd out with public provisioning, right? So like, we're very, very, very critical, but at the same time, we also don't see the multinational corporate media production as univocal, right? And it's doing all kinds of crazy things all the time, right? And sometimes it's highly, highly problematic. Sometimes it's less. Sometimes it's interesting and exciting. And WandaVision seems to be pretty interesting and exciting. Maybe the way I'll put a cherry on top of this and what you just said is what you were talking about kind of reminds me of something that Paul Bettany said, right, who plays Vision, in an interview. And somebody asked him, what was your favorite scene or scene to shoot or something like that? And he didn't actually answer the question because he didn't talk about a scene. He said, my favorite part was when we wrapped the shoot. And by the way, they had started shooting in early 2020, and then COVID made them shut down. Then they came back in the fall of 2020 and had rigorous protocols, as other shows have, and were able to shoot and complete the project and do post-production and release it without anybody getting sick, right? Because they had the care and the money and the investment and the wherewithal to create a situation to orchestrate this production. And he said, my favorite part of making this was when we wrapped and we realized that we had done it. We had finished this whole thing without anybody getting sick because, and I think he says something like this, because everybody, followed the rules, right? And like, what a better way of acknowledging that, it's abstract mediation and coordination at a distance, including money, but also aesthetics, that gets us through, right?
Law.
That maintains us. And that, yeah, right. Law, rules, right? Not univocal law, but rules that shift with different urgencies and different time periods, right? So I found that to be really poignant and, showing us kind of at this extra textual level, what some of the potentialities or the potencies of the kind of queer magic of this show brings to the fore.
Money is queer after all.
Money is queer after all.
Can't catch all your twisted words before they're walking. At least that's what I heard. Trying to pick them as you're talking, causing both minds to blur. Taking shape, they fail you, each one missing its mark. Unperturbed, they've derailed me. Our mouths and minds are too far apart. Shallow words are the words we use, and shallow words say nothing new. And shallow work is the work we do, and shallow work breeds nothing new. Love them when I see them, but lose me if they follow. I only need to please them, but my mouth feels somewhat hollow. We grew up underwater, now our eyes hurt. Eyes are sunken, limbs are shrunken down in the folds of our shirts. And as we sink low, the pressure grows. As we sink low, the pressure grows.
Opening the curtains and letting the light in, letting it touch my skin, letting it consume and shimmer. And as I turn back around towards the bed, I am opening up the book and flicking through the pages and putting pen to paper. But the words just aren't coming out. It's like they haven't even been inventing it. And as I stop and think, I'm drifting slowly further and further apart. And I'm trying to work out exactly what it means to be alive, but it seems so hard.
Only wax screws the silence between all this, so no mouths can run. And you've waited for the silence all year to unstick your tongue. 'Cause shallow words are never true, your shallow words are never true. Yeah, shallow words breed nothing new, shallow words breed nothing new. It cuts our teeth, and it cuts our teeth again, and it bites our tongue, it bites our tongue again, and it cuts our teeth, it cuts our teeth again, it cuts our teeth. It cuts our teeth again.
I'm pressing my hand to the vein on my wrist and I'm trying to find the pulse, but I think it's not there. And there's all these little jits and joggers and these little stops and starts that are flashing around. And as I look out again, I'm trying to just see. I'm trying to just think, and I'm trying to just feel. And I know that I'm here, and I know that I'm real, but I just don't know why I can't quite explain myself. It's just these things.
The rustling thoughtless lust, transport of giddy joy, and a whisper of manic mirth from another hydra, headstrong boy. Fulfillment of sweaty arrogance, on a scale of sliding sorrow, to a fluster of surprise, to a flutter of distant surprise. Further anticipation to this chaotic wonder, forging tongue with one loose and gold. Hydra headstrong boy.
Bite my tongue.
Hydra headstrong boy.
Bite my tongue. It's words.
A rustle of thoughtless lust to a transport of giddy joy, and a whisper of manic mirth to another hydra headstrong boy. Fulfillment of sweaty arrogance, a scale of sliding sorrow.
Yes,
From a fluster of surprise to a flutter of distant cries.
these words.
anticipation is its chaotic wonder. So you hold your tongue with